All right.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Conversations in History program for today, Sunday, March 29th, 2020. It's hard to believe that Travis and I are having to do this from the comforts of our own home, but it is a kind of a new world that we're living in. So welcome. This is the first in our 2020 lecture series. Of course, we were supposed to be at historic Mount Zion Church today, but instead we're reaching out to you via the wonderful efforts of the internet. I'm Tracy Gillespie. I am a historic sites manager for Nova Parks, and we have been partnering for many years now with the Mosby Heritage Area Association for this Conversation in History lecture series. I'm really excited today and very, very grateful to Travis Shaw for two reasons. First of all, Travis has set up this Zoom meeting, and for me, who's kind of a dinosaur with this technology, I really appreciate that. And secondly, I appreciate, Travis, that you are speaking for us today about Lord Dunmore, or Governor Dunmore. This is a person and a time in our history that I've been fascinated by. I'm fully prepared for this. I have behind me on my mantle a Stamp Act teapot from Colonial Williamsburg, or should I say no Stamp Act teapot. So I am ready to hear more about our last royal governor of Virginia, as they would say in Scotland, Lord Dunmore. So Travis, I'm turning it over to you there with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. And again, thanks, and thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks a
All
lot,
right.
Travis.
Thank you, Tracy. Such a pleasure to be able to work with Nova Parks on this program. So hopefully in the future we'll be able to do more of these. We have more scheduled for later in the year, and hopefully they'll be live this time. So thank you for bearing with us. The technological limitations right now, we've had a few issues today. Also, thank you for bearing with my growing quarantine beard and my hair that's going out of control. So as Tracy said, I'm with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. Many of you have been to programs of ours in the past, have probably met me before. Before I came to Mosby Heritage, my experience was largely in museum education at early American sites, colonial sites, like historic St. Mary's City or George Washington's Mount Vernon. And that's really where my area of expertise lay. So today we're going to be talking about one of those colonial topics. We're going to be talking about Lord Dunmore. He was the last colonial governor of Virginia. And we're going to talk about Dunmore as a man, Dunmore's kind of how his actions led into the coming of the American Revolution. And then we'll talk about the military campaign that takes place here in Virginia from the summer of 1775 to the summer of 1776 that will ultimately result in British authority completely collapsing in the colony. So thank you so much for joining us. Let's dive right in. Let's see how I can do this. All right. Okay. So yes, thank you again to Nova Parks for hosting us. There we go. So I call this program Delenda S. Norfolk, and that's a quote from Thomas Jefferson that we'll talk about as it comes up in our story. And when he said that, Jefferson was paraphrasing a famous quote from the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. The original quote was Delenda S. Carthage. Carthage must be destroyed. Jefferson is going to say that about the city of Norfolk, because that is Dunmore's primary base of operations. It's the heart of loyalist sentiment in Virginia. And true to Jefferson's words, the city of Norfolk, the sixth largest city in the colonies at the time, will be destroyed. If you've ever been to Norfolk and wondered why there aren't any colonial era buildings, it's because of these actions. So, keep that in mind as we go forward. But let's start with the man. Let's start with Lord Dunmore. John Murray was born in 1730 in Perthshire in Scotland. He was born into a wealthy and well-connected family. His grandfather was the first Earl of Dunmore. At the time of his birth, his uncle was the second Earl of Dunmore. So again, a part of the peerage, very well-connected family. Those connections are going to be strained, however, shortly, not too long after John Murray's birth. In 1745, we have the coming of the last big Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. Now, the Jacobites are a movement that's been around since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It's an attempt to put the Stuarts back on the throne of Great Britain. In this case, it's Bonnie Prince Charlie is the one who's campaigning in Scotland, trying to find supporters in the Highlands of Scotland to support his claim on the British throne. Now, these risings have happened periodically between 1688 and 1745. The 45 will be the last big Jacobite uprising, and it will split the Murray family. The second Earl of Dunmore, John Murray's uncle, is going to remain loyal to the crown, loyal to King George, and he actually will become one of King George's most trusted military commanders. He's fighting on the continent, he's fighting in like Belgium, the Netherlands, and so forth as part of this wider war. Now, John Murray and his father will actually take the opposite side. They will join Bonnie Prince Charlie. They will join the Jacobite rebellion in their attempt to overthrow the Hanoverian kings and establish the Stuarts back on the throne of Great Britain. Now, initially, the Jacobite uprising is going to go very well for the Jacobites. They take control of much of Scotland. They march south into England. But very quickly, the tide will turn, and the breaking point is going to come at the Battle of Culloden. This is a depiction from the period of the battle. On the right, we see the long lines of government troops, troops both English and Scottish who are loyal to the Hanoverian kings. And then on the left, the Jacobites, those who are fighting for Bonnie Prince Charlie. There's a lot of myth, a lot of kind of romanticization about this battle. You see depictions of like these Highlanders and their plaids charging with broadswords at these lines of redcoats and so forth. I think this image is probably a little closer to the truth. Period accounts really, really discuss that it is much more conventional of a battle. We have both the Jacobite army and the government army are going to be operating, in lines, linear formations, typical of what you'd see for the day. There is going to be a famous charge of some of the Highlanders hand to hand. You see that depicted down in the lower right. They will be absolutely decimated. The Jacobite army is going to be defeated there on the field. We know that the future Lord Dunmore, John Murray, is there. He's a 15-year-old page who's serving in the court of Bonnie Prince Charlie. So this is going to have a tremendous effect on this young man moving forward. And here's a picture of the battlefield that the Gillespies were nice enough to send me. If you ever get a chance, it's a wonderful, wonderful site to visit. So the Jacobites are defeated at Culloden. John Murray's father will be arrested for his role in the rebellion. This is in 1746. He'll actually plead guilty to high treason. Now, due to his family connections, due to the fact that the current Earl Dunmore, the second Earl of Dunmore, is loyal, he's a trusted general in the King's army, he will receive a pardon. He basically ends up in house arrest for a few years, and that is the only punishment he gets for his role in this rebellion. His son, the 15-year-old John Murray, the future governor of Virginia, is also pardoned. And within a few years, he is actually serving like his uncle in the British Army. About 4 years after the Battle of Culloden, he is a commissioned officer in the British Army. It's a pretty remarkable turnaround, and he really has the influence of his uncle to thank. So Dunmore's career in the Army is fairly short. It's fairly not much to say about it. He serves during an era that's largely peaceful for the most part. He doesn't really see a whole lot of military action. But what it will do is it will increase his political standing. And so in 1770, he will receive his first political appointment of note. And that will be as governor of New York City, or New York colony. He sails to New York City in 1770. And what he finds there is an environment that is completely different than what he's used to. Dunmore is a man very much brought up in a hierarchical system. I mean, the Scottish clan system that he grew up in is very, very much based on social rank, on family connections, and personal loyalty. And he finds very little of that in the colonies. In New York, he finds lots of different political factions that are all squabbling with one another. As governor, he expects to come in as the executive to lay down the law and expects everyone to listen to what he has to say, to follow his orders. And that does not happen. There's already kind of well-established political machines going on in New York. So it's a rude awakening for him, and again, something that will continue to influence his outlook in the coming years. So he spends just a few months in New York, not very long. While he's there, he gets into all kinds of fights with the local landowning aristocracy, the political establishment, but he also makes some headway in trying to enrich himself, and that's a theme that will kind of come up again and again. He arrives in America, there's tons of land, and as governor, it's one of his prerogatives to issue land patents. And he will try to kind of bend the rules as much as possible to ensure that he ends up with huge swaths of land in his personal ownership. Now, this is not unusual at the time. Every governor in America, every well-connected political appointee in America is doing this kind of thing. But Dunmore really seems to raise people's ire, whether it's because he's kind of a rough guy, not an easy person to get along with, very imperious, or he just didn't have the political connections to get away with it. He is going to receive a lot of flack for this. At one point, he personally claims tens of thousands of acres in what is now Vermont, and he's still trying to claim that in 1771 when he is issued a new order, and that is that he is now the governor of Virginia. He does not want to leave New York. He's working on these schemes for personal enrichment. He's just kind of finding his place in the political machine of the colony. But he gets repeated calls that he has to go. He has to go. This is not a question. This is not an option. It's an order. And so finally, in September of 1771, he will arrive in the Old Dominion. Now, it's very difficult for him almost from the start because he's succeeding one of the most popular colonial governors in Virginia history, and that is Lord Botetourt. Botetourt had been governor for only 2 years, incredibly popular, especially with the political elite of Virginia, and now Dunmore has to step in and fill those shoes. He will take up residence in the governor's palace at Williamsburg. At first, things go fairly well for Dunmore. In fact, he ends up naming his youngest daughter, who's born there, Virginia, after the colony. But in short order, Dunmore will begin to butt heads with the colonial elite in Virginia, just as he had done in New York. Again, he's expecting obedience, he's expecting respect for hierarchy, he's expecting personal loyalty from these people, and he is going to get none of that. And Dunmore may have been a good military officer. He's personally brave, extremely loyal to those around him, but he is not a tactful man. And the more that the House of Burgesses pushes back against his authority, the more he will double down. And this is going to be the story of the next few years, between 1771 and 1775. The House of Burgesses will challenge him. He will shut down the House of Burgesses. They will continue to irritate him. He'll reopen the House of Burgesses. They will shut down again, just back and forth and back and forth. Now, the one defining moment of his pre-revolutionary governorship will come in 1774, and that's with an event called Dunmore's War. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail. Dunmore's War is a war to expand Virginia authority in the Ohio Valley. Virginia has these claims going all the way west through Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, that whole old Northwest area. They're fighting with Pennsylvania over who has claim over the forks of the Ohio, where modern day Pittsburgh is. There's Native American tribes, nations that are living in this area who are resistant to settlement from Virginia. And Dunmore will actually lead a military campaign against these natives to really assert Virginia's dominance over this region. And this is really kind of the high point of his governorship in terms of popularity. A lot of Virginians, particularly Virginians who own claim to a lot of that land in the Ohio country, are going to be all for this conflict. They want to make sure that their claims are respected over Pennsylvania's claims and over the Native American claims that are the Native Americans who are living there. It's a short conflict. There's really only one sizable battle. It's a triumphant conflict. Dunmore returns to Williamsburg, at the head of this triumph. But his success will be short-lived. During the same time, there's situation going on in Boston where resistance to British rule is escalating. They've shut down the port of Boston after the Tea Party. The Intolerable Acts have been passed. There's martial law, and the House of Burgesses in Virginia will pass a resolution basically in support of their brethren up in Boston, and this infuriates Dunmore. Again, he's coming from this very hierarchical background, this background of obedience to the empire, and it infuriates him. So he will actually shut down the House of Burgesses, basically shutting down the entire civilian government of Virginia. The House will actually leave the Capitol and will meet down the street in a tavern, continue to meet and to issue proclamations and to organize the government completely separate from Lord Dunmore. They've cut the executive out of this equation. And this is terrifying for Dunmore. This is a very scary moment. Probably the most pressing issue in all of this is that when you dissolve the government of Virginia, you're dissolving all of the branches of the government, and that includes the militia. The militia is an armed branch of the government. It's maintained by the colonial government, supposed to serve at the behest of the governor. And without the House of Burgesses, without this, legislative body in place, the militia, for all intents and purposes, ceases to exist, at least in any form that is state regulated. So now Dunmore, should things come to blows, has no protection that he can rely on. He has no troops that he can put down, because unlike Boston or New York City, there are no real British garrisons in Virginia. The only British armed presence are a handful of ships out in the Chesapeake Bay and, whatever sailors and Marines are aboard those ships. So should things come to blows, Dunmore is basically sitting completely exposed. And he has every reason to fear, because those old militia systems, those militia companies, are going to start to reform as volunteer companies. And these armed volunteers are not going to serve at Dunmore's request. They are going to serve at the request of men like Patrick Henry, George Washington, other well-to-do planters who are, beginning to find their way into this growing movement for independence, or at least, armed conflict with Britain. So there are literally thousands of armed men training all around Virginia, and Dunmore has no way to protect himself. So all of this is going to come to a head on April 20th of 1775, just one day after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Now, people in Virginia have no idea what's going on in Lexington and Concord at this time, but they're going to have their own crisis to deal with. Concerned over these growing formations of armed men who are beyond his control, Lord Dunmore is going to hatch a scheme to take the powder and weapons out of the government stores in Williamsburg, that funny-looking public magazine that's there in the center of the town, and evacuate it to those Royal Navy vessels out in the Chesapeake Bay. So on the night of April 20th, 19th to 20th, armed sailors and Marines from the HMS Magdalene are going to sneak ashore in the dead of night. They're going to set up at the governor's mansion, and in the dead of night, they're going to go to the powder magazine and start removing the gunpowder and taking it down to ships waiting in the river. This plot is uncovered very quickly. There's a huge alarm that is raised throughout Williamsburg. People are panicking because people can see exactly what Dunmore is doing. He's doing what British authorities had done up in New England and other places in the colonies. Now, Dunmore comes up with an excuse. It's a pretty flimsy one. He says that he was just removing the powder because he's gotten word that there is going to be a slave insurrection. And that if those slaves were to get a hold of the guns and the ammunition in the magazine, it would be a bloodbath. So he's just keeping it safe for everybody. This quiets some of the initial fears, but men like Patrick Henry are going to seize upon what is happening. And over the next 9 days or so, as word begins to filter down from Massachusetts of what's happened at Lexington and Concord, these armed volunteer companies are going to start to march on Williamsburg. Patrick Henry, leading the Hanover County Volunteers, is going to get within about 10 or 15 miles of the city before he is stopped, and they're able to work out a way for everyone to save face. Dunmore agrees to pay the colony for the powder taken, about 300 pounds sterling worth of powder, and that allows both Patrick Henry and Dunmore to save a little bit of face. Patrick Henry comes out the hero. You know, he and his men have stood up for American rights. They've gotten payment for the powder. Dunmore walks away still maintaining that he had the authority to seize the powder as governor, that it belonged to the crown government versus the colonial legislature. And this is really a tipping point. It gives men like Patrick Henry an incredible amount of popular appeal, whereas Dunmore ends up looking kind of weak in all of this. You know, he certainly does not want to let this blow up into open bloodshed, but it seems to a lot of people that he kind of backed down in the face of Patrick Henry. So the initial crisis is over, but the next few weeks remain extremely tense. Dunmore will move his family out of Williamsburg. He'll move them to this home here. This is Portobello. It's its hunting lodge located just outside of Williamsburg on the site of modern-day Camp Perry, the military installation. So he will move his family there. And on April 22nd, he makes this incredible proclamation. He says that, you know, if armed men threaten Williamsburg again, that he will declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. And this will end up being a pretty prophetic statement from Dunmore, but it just gives you an idea of how tense things are. You know, Dunmore, as I said, he's not a very tactful guy, and he's a very stubborn man, and he is willing to go through with his word should he not get the results that he desires. So he will send his family to Portobello. He will join them just a few weeks later. May 8th, I believe, is when he arrives, or excuse me. May 8th, he arrives at Portobello with his family. So the governor, his family, have effectively abandoned the capital, leaving Williamsburg completely open to the Virginia legislature, the House of Burgesses, to men like Patrick Henry, who are quickly seizing control of the colony from any sort of vestiges of British control. So where do we go from here? Dunmore finally decides on May 12th that it is no longer safe for him and his family to be anywhere near Williamsburg. Williamsburg is not safe, obviously. Portobello is not safe. There are armed men marching on Portobello. So he actually gets word right before these armed men arrive to arrest him. and he and his family will flee from this home into the HMS Foey, which is a ship waiting just off the way in the James River, or excuse me, York River. So the ship is waiting in the York River to receive Dunmore and his family, and this really, in my mind, marks the end of British control in Virginia. They are never, ever able, over the next few years, to establish and reassert royal control over any part of Virginia for any serious length of time. Dunmore has abdicated, essentially, his position as the royal governor. Now, that doesn't mean he's not going to try. So from here, we're going to talk about the ongoing military campaign in which Lord Dunmore tries to reassert his dominance over the colony. So to go back to this map real quick, this is a good map of Virginia. I'm not sure if you guys, oh, there's my little pointer. So Williamsburg, right over here. The middle peninsula, or not the middle peninsula, the lower peninsula in between the James and the York River. Portobello was located just north of that. Dunmore is going to head to the place where he thinks he is going to get the most support, and that is the city of Norfolk, which is all the way down here, the very southeastern part of Virginia. It's a better map right there. So Williamsburg, the red star up there, that smaller star is Portobello, and then here is Norfolk, all the way down the southeast along the Elizabeth River. Why Norfolk? Norfolk is considered the hotbed of loyalist sentiment in Virginia. And there's many, many reasons for that. It's the largest city in Virginia, 6,000 inhabitants at this point. The most important port between Charleston and Philadelphia. It's the 6th largest city in America at the time. Simply put, it's the most important city in Virginia in 1775. It's got a nice sheltered deep water port. There's a reason why the Navy is still there in Norfolk to this day. It's got a massive shipbuilding industry, which might come in handy. Sproul Shipyard over in Portsmouth, just across the river. Andrew Sproul is a committed loyalist, friend of Dunmore's, so he figures he can get support there. And it offers control of the entire Chesapeake Bay. If you control Norfolk, you can control any commerce, any shipping coming in and out of the bay. So Dunmore figures if he can hold on to Norfolk, he can cut off this rebellion before it grows too big. As I said, it's considered a very strong location in terms of loyalism as well. It's a cosmopolitan city. You have people coming from all over the British Empire. The Scots are a particularly strong bloc in Norfolk. A lot of the Scottish merchants who dealt in the tobacco trade are based in Norfolk. These are men who people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry owe a ton of money to, because they're the ones that are kind of managing the tobacco trade from these plantations in Virginia back to Britain. So they have a vested interest in upholding crown authority. Also, many of them are Scots who are familiar with Dunmore, familiar with Dunmore's family, so there's some familial connections there. Aside from that, there are a lot of tradesmen, artisans, shipbuilders, people who rely on trade, and they're afraid that if the British shut down the port of Norfolk, if Patriots take control, they will be shut out of their industries. They will no longer be able to work. Just to give you an idea of how people felt about Norfolk at the time, here's a comment from the Virginia Gazette newspaper. The situation of Norfolk and Portsmouth is very different from that of any other place in Virginia. The inhabitants are almost to a man merchants and mechanics, and a majority of them are Scotsmen and rank Tories. Their town is full of slaves ready for an insurrection at the beck of their leader. Now, again, we have another comment here. Dunmore's already said he's willing to free the slaves, burn everything down. Now we see people on the Patriot side saying, this town is full of slaves willing to rise up at the beck of their leader. So Dunmore has already established that this drastic step, this idea that he is willing to free enslaved people in exchange for them fighting against their former masters, is already on the table. People are already talking about this. And this is an absolutely terrifying prospect to most people in Virginia. This is their worst nightmare come true. In the 1770s, Virginia has tens of thousands of enslaved people. In some parts of Virginia, they outnumber free inhabitants. And so this is a very real fear that should these people take up arms, that it could be an absolute bloodbath. So let's go back to that comment, that quote from Thomas Jefferson that we started with. Delenda est Norfolk. Norfolk must be destroyed. He writes that during this period to his friend John Page. He says, Norfolk must be destroyed. And Page agreed with him. Page wrote back, the people of Norfolk are under dreadful apprehension of having their town burnt by this detachment. He's speaking of patriot troops. They know they deserve it, but we seem at a loss of what to do with them. Many of them deserved to be ruined and hanged, but others have acted dastardly for want of protection. But at all events, rather than the town should be garrisoned by our enemies and a trade opened for all the scoundrels in this country, we must be prepared to destroy it. So we have these two huge threats. On Dunmore's hand, we've got the threat of raising enslaved people in general insurrection against the Patriots. And on the other hand, we have Patriot leaders, including Thomas Jefferson, calling for the destruction of the largest city in Virginia in order to help stave that off. It is amazing to me how quickly Virginia descends into this serious divide, and just how serious that divide becomes between patriot and loyalist. I mean, we're talking about just a few months after Lexington and Concord, and already people are talking about widespread insurrection and destruction. There's, John Page is saying they deserve to be ruined and hanged. There is no love lost between these two sides. So Dunmore is going to spend the summer of 1775 doing what he can to raise support within the colony. Support is not forthcoming from Britain. They're tied down with what's going on up north around Boston. That's seen as the seat of this rebellion. Dunmore's situation doesn't even show up on most leaders' radar at this time. He's frantically writing to everyone he can, trying to find reinforcements. During the summer, he does receive about 60 men from the 14th Regiment of Foot. But 60 men plus whatever sailors and Marines isn't enough to reassert control over the colony. So Dunmore realizes that summer, if he is going to win this fight, he's going to have to raise his own army, and he's going to have to do it locally. So he's going to order thousands of muskets from Britain in the kind of hope that he will have men to carry them into battle on his behalf. And this small fleet of British ships is going to roam around the Chesapeake Bay that summer. They are going to be raiding Patriot plantations for supplies, food and other supplies that they need. But they are also going to start carrying off enslaved people. This is not official British policy at this point, but Dunmore, like I would say many leaders, during the American Civil War in the 1860s, saw that plantation slavery was the economic backbone of Virginia. And so by depriving the enemy of the labor of these enslaved people, that they would weaken their resolve, they would weaken their ability to make war. And so it becomes an unofficial policy in the summer of 1775 to take any enslaved people who want to come along and take them to Dunmore's fleet. And this is going to happen repeatedly up and down the York River, the James River, over on the eastern shore of Virginia, pretty much the entire lower Chesapeake Bay. As soon as these British ships pull into sight, a lot of enslaved people are going to come down and meet them. A lot of plantation owners are going to do their best to hide their livestock, hide their slaves, and so forth. But this is certainly not going to endear Dunmore to many of the planters in Southern Virginia. This policy is going to continue into the fall of 1775, and it's in October that the first blood of this military campaign will finally be spilt. On October 25th, a small ship's boat from the HMS Otter is making one of these little raids on some plantations around the port of Hampton. I know it's hard to think of Hampton as a small kind of colonial port today, but this ship's boat will run aground. Patriot militia will capture it. They'll actually capture some of the sailors from this little expedition. And this infuriates Dunmore. So he will send a larger force back to Hampton on the 25th in order to punish the town, punish them for their insolence. So they arrive there on the 25th. The ships are not able to get up the channel and to the town itself, so they start landing troops outside the town. And over the next day, more and more Virginians, more and more Patriot militiamen are going to arrive in Hampton to try and drive off this small British expedition. These militiamen will take up kind of barricades along the waterfront of the town. They have riflemen stationed up in buildings to shoot down at the British vessels. Two of the British transports that are carrying troops into the channel will actually run aground. 10 British soldiers and sailors and Marines are captured. One of them is killed. There's an enslaved man who's trying to escape with the British. He's also killed. So it's a small fight. The skirmish at Hampton in October is not a big battle by any stretch of the imagination, but it is the first blood that will be spilt as part of this military campaign. And it will set the stage for really the next 2 months of conflict that are going to happen in the lower Chesapeake. So following this little repulse at Hampton, Dunmore will return to Norfolk. Now this is kind of an odd map because in the original north is down, so I flipped it around. But just to give you an idea, you can see Norfolk kind of here on the center left. Portsmouth is just across the Elizabeth River. And if we follow the Elizabeth River east, you can see there's a town called Kemp's Landing. And then to the south, the town of Great Bridge. This is the scene of action between October and December of 1775. So following this failed attempt to punish the town of Hampton, Dunmore will return to Norfolk, and he will continue to kind of bide his time and build up his forces. Norfolk, again, has a lot of loyalists. Some of those loyalists are going to start volunteering for him. With his small group of troops, again, about 60 regular soldiers of the 14th Regiment, about 20 or 30 loyalist volunteers, Dunmore is going to set out for his next raid, and that will be on the small town of Kemp's Landing, which is, as I said, just east of Norfolk. So he gets word that Patriot militia is mustering there, that there's several hundred men gathering there in pretty good strength there to march on Norfolk, and he decides that it is probably best if he preempts them rather than sitting around and waiting. One thing that will come up continually is Dunmore is a man of action. He is very personally brave, and he certainly understands the value of momentum. Strike the enemy before they get too strong to hurt. So these men will set off. They will head to Kemp's Landing. They will run into about 300 militiamen. So there's like double their numbers of militia. And the militia will try to ambush Dunmore's forces, but will actually be driven back. 5 of the militiamen are killed, over 30 are wounded. Dunmore's forces suffer no casualties. Again, it's a small battle, but it's the kind of victory that Dunmore is looking for. He raises the royal standard in Kemp's Landing. Hundreds of militiamen from the surrounding countryside, from Princess Anne County, will march in to join his cause. including a lot of the militiamen that he had just driven off during the skirmish. So this is really the high point of Dunmore's campaign. It's his biggest victory, even though it's a small skirmish. And it gives him a tremendous amount of momentum. Again, he's got the advantage at this point. This is early November of 1775. And he is going to use that momentum to issue his most famous proclamation, the thing that Dunmore is usually remembered for nowadays more than anything else. On November 15th, following his victory at the Battle of Kemp's Landing, he issues a proclamation. Again, I like to draw parallels with the Civil War. You know, just as Lincoln needed a military victory to shore up his issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, that's exactly what Dunmore is doing here. He's got his victory, he's got the momentum, he's got the political capital. He is going to issue this proclamation. And this proclamation is going to declare martial law over all Virginia. It's going to call on all Virginians to take up arms to put down this rebellion. Most importantly, and most revolutionary, he is going to offer freedom to any indentured servant or enslaved person who is willing to take up arms against their patriot master. And it's important that I point out, it only, at least in the letter of the law, applies to those enslaved by patriots. Throughout this whole situation, Dunmore himself is a slave owner. He has slaves with him during all of this. But he is offering freedom in exchange for military service. And this is remarkable. It's revolutionary. It's the first really wide-scale government emancipation in America. And it's also important because it strikes at the heart of patriot fears. You know, for months, Dunmore's been toying with this idea, threatening to unleash armed slaves upon Virginia. Patriot leaders, as we saw in that Virginia Gazette article, are worried that he's going to do this. So he finally does it in November of 1775. And it's electrifying. If Dunmore was not popular in Virginia before this happened, he is now anathema. One leader, let's see if I can find this quote here. One person responded by saying, "Hell itself could not have vomited anything more black than Dunmore's design of emancipating the slaves." George Washington declares that Dunmore is the most dangerous man, the most dangerous opponent to American liberty there is. And as long as Dunmore is alive, Americans will not be safe. It's even referenced in the Declaration of Independence. If you read, there's a part in the Declaration where they're listing grievances against the Crown. They say that the Crown has incited domestic rebellion against us. So this is a major watershed moment in the American Revolution. Now, as far as Dunmore is concerned, it's a pretty good move. What happens is probably, we don't know the exact numbers, but maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000, 1,500 to 2,000 enslaved people, men, women, and children, will flock to his cause. He will begin to organize the men into what he refers to as the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. This is a regiment of former slaves armed with those imported weapons from Britain that are going to become one of the major kind of backbones of Dunmore's small military force. Now, they're going to be under the command of white officers, but it will be fairly well integrated into Dunmore's army, his small army that he's assembling in Norfolk. He will also recruit white loyalists. After the Battle of Kemp's Landing, all these militiamen that come pouring in to take up the cause, rally around the British standard, they will be formed into a regiment as well, known as the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. Let's talk about the men who actually made up these groups. Actually, I forgot I put a slide in here. Just to give people kind of a modern context to what's going on here. This is a modern satellite image kind of showing the same locations that were so important in that last map. We have Norfolk up there, kind of in the top left, Norfolk and Portsmouth. Kemp's Landing is all the way over here, incredibly urbanized area, not much to see there, and Great Bridge all the way down to the south. And here's an image of Dunmore's proclamation. If you're really interested in it, you can actually read it online at like Colonial Williamsburg's website. Remarkable in its effect on the Revolution in Virginia. So we're going to talk about some of the men who made up these regiments. The leadership of these Loyalist regiments is going to be drawn from kind of the top tier of Virginia society, at least in the southeastern part of the state. The commander of the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment is going to be a 33-year-old planter named Jacob Elgood. He lived at a plantation called Rose Hall, which is down where Virginia Beach is now. Elgood will name his brother-in-law, 21-year-old John Saunders, as his kind of second in command. This is a portrait of Saunders on the left that's painted well after the war, probably 15 or 18 or so years after he first took command of the within the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. And these two are pretty typical of the aristocracy in Southeast Virginia. They're planters, they're well connected. John Saunders, he had studied law in Philadelphia. This brick home that you see here, that's Pembroke, that's where he lived. Very much the cream of the crop. Other officers that took command, Stair Agnew was the ensign of the regiment. He was the son of an Anglican minister. His father preached against the revolution. He preached, loyalty to the British cause and was actually driven from his church for doing that. So his son Stair will join Dunmore. The rank and file of these regiments, I think have a tendency to think of loyalists as men like Elgood or Saunders, very well-to-do, very wealthy, very conservative, kind of stuffy. But the rank and file of the regiments really is a cross-section of Norfolk society. People of all ranks, all backgrounds are going to take up arms in support of Dunmore. And this is kind of true of loyalism everywhere. It's not just limited to one particular group of people or one class of people. The men in the Queen's Own include merchants, artisans and craftsmen, sailors, indentured servants. A few of the individuals who I've been able to track down, there's a guy named John Hardy, who's a tavern keeper, a guy named James Fraser, who's a shoemaker, John Carmont, shopkeeper. So it's really, as I said, all levels of society, not just the wealthy Saunders and Elgood types, who are joining in the fight. The Ethiopian regiment will be led by a Scotsman, John Mackay. We don't know their true strength. Records for this regiment and for this period are extremely hard to come by. As I said, we think maybe 1,000, 1,500, maybe 2,000 people, enslaved people, flee to Dunmore, men, women, and children. But the Ethiopian regiment is probably going to be just a couple hundred men. At least 200 are armed by the end of the year. That's about the best guess we have. So as I said, led by John Mackay. Another officer is going to join them a little later on, and that is Thomas Taylor Bird. Bird will serve as a captain in the Ethiopian regiment. And why this is remarkable is Thomas Taylor Bird is descended from the Birds of Westover, one of the wealthiest families in the entire colony. Before the war, Thomas had been commissioned officer in the British Army. He returns to America, trying to help out however he can. He's sent to Virginia. He actually asked to come to Virginia. He says, as a native Virginian, I can help Dunmore. I can help him get the rebellion under control. So Thomas Taylor Bird will serve in the Ethiopian regiment. So Dunmore has got, by this point, some more soldiers from the 14th Regiment. He's got about 150 regular British soldiers from the 14th Regiment. He's got, maybe 200 or so armed men in the Ethiopian Regiment, probably a similar number in the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. It's a small army. And he is going to try from Norfolk to reassert control over the rest of the state. And, you know, he's feeling very, very ambitious about this, you know, very, very good about his chances. I mean, he's already driven off a huge body of militia at Kemp's Landing. So he expects that that is going to be, you know, that is going to continue. So here we are back at the map. Dunmore's got his army up in the vicinity of Norfolk. And he gets word that there are two forces that are about to combine to work against him. Up around Williamsburg, we have William Woodford and the 2nd Virginia Regiment. There are also a few other companies of Virginia troops hanging around the area. So there's several hundred men massing around Williamsburg. And then to the south, there's a body of North Carolinians under Robert Howe assembling. Now, both of these forces individually are going to be bigger than Dunmore's army, but should they combine, there's going to be absolutely no way that Dunmore is going to be able to defeat them. So again, Dunmore is going to act boldly, he's going to act quickly, and he's going to zero in on one strategic location, and that is the town of Great Bridge down here at the bottom of our map. Great Bridge is called Great Bridge because, surprise, there is a big bridge there. It's the main thoroughfare between Norfolk and North Carolina. So if he can march there and defeat one Patriot column, it's going to give him a chance to then turn around and defeat the other Patriot column in detail. And he knows if he wastes any time and those two columns combine, he will have no chance. So he has to hold Great Bridge. He's going to send men from the 14th Regiment and some of the Queen's Own, some of the Ethiopians, to build what is known as Fort Murray. This is a period map. It's a little hard to see, but up at the top, again, north was down, so I flipped it. You have this square structure up at the top. That is Fort Murray. Fort Murray is built alongside one of the bridges. Then there's a small kind of islandy, marshy causeway in the center with the actual town of Great Bridge, just a few buildings stretched out along the road. So they build Fort Murray, they fortify it. The two sides are going to start skirmishing in the vicinity. Those troops, the Patriot troops, are going to take up a position on the southern end of the Great Bridge. Fort Murray's on the northern end. They're going to go back and forth for a few weeks, taking pot shots at each other, burning buildings, harassing each other. But this is the Patriot plan. They're stalling for time. They know that once those troops combine, Dunmore is done. So on December 9th, Dunmore decides he has to take action. And so he will formulate a plan to drive the Patriots from the southern end of Great Bridge and hopefully defeat them in detail. The plan is a fairly simple one. He is going to send the Ethiopian Regiment around through the swamps, through the marsh, to try and attack the Patriot fortifications from the rear. He's going to send his best troops, the 14th Regiment of Foot, led by their grenadiers, you know, the strongest, toughest, best men in the regiment, straight up the road across the Great Bridge to attack the fortifications head on, hopefully while the Ethiopians come around behind and attack from the rear. Unfortunately, nothing goes as Dunmore plans. The Ethiopian Regiment either gets lost or delayed. We don't exactly know what happens, but we do know that they never end up showing up behind the Patriot fortifications. They do not manage to flank them, which leaves those men of the 14th Regiment completely unsupported. They are attacking Patriot fortifications, breastworks, full on, no cover, and to do so they have to cross a causeway, an exposed bridge. The bridge is partially dismantled by the Patriots, so that's slowing their advance down. They get within about 50 yards or so of the Patriot fortifications, and you can kind of see those fortifications on the map here, this kind of like zigzaggy line. They get within 50 yards, and the Patriots open fire. And again, these British troops are packed extremely tight on this bridge. There's no way for them to go. Some of them are trying to wade through the swamp on the other side. It's a nightmare. The Patriots open fire. Captain Fordyce, who's leading the Grenadier Company, he's hit. He goes down. A second volley rings out. Captain Fordyce is hit at least 14 more times. So that gives you an idea of the volume of fire that is going into these British troops. Some of the Grenadiers make it within 20 yards of the American fortifications, but they just can't keep up the attack. It's such a narrow bridge. It's been dismantled. There's guys in the swamp trying to get their way as close as they can. They can't keep up a concentrated attack. And in a few short volleys, they're defeated, and Dunmore's chances of holding on to the city of Norfolk become very, very, very slim. William Woodford of the 2nd Virginia wrote, "It was a second Bunker's Hill affair in miniature, with this difference, that we kept our post." So throwing a little shade on the New Englanders. "We kept our post and had only one man wounded in the hand." So the Patriots suffer one man wounded, shot in the finger. Dunmore's losses are horrific. 3 officers are killed, including Captain Fordyce. 14 men are killed. 1 other officer and 48 other men are wounded. And this is the cream of his army. These are not his volunteers. These are not ex-militiamen. These are British regulars, and they're the only regular troops he has. And in a matter of minutes, he loses over a quarter of them, a third of them. It's a devastating blow. And it doesn't take long for Dunmore to realize that he is going to have to abandon Norfolk. So his army, or what's left of it, will limp back to Norfolk and prepare for evacuation. The people of Norfolk realize this, and they begin to panic. Again, many of them are loyalists. They've already read that, in Patriot papers, that they want to burn the city. They want to hang these people. They want to, do all these terrible things. And so they fear for their lives. They fear for their property. They will join Dunmore in his retreat. They will take to ships in the harbor. Dunmore, of course, has a handful of small Royal Navy vessels. Those are going to be joined by dozens and dozens and dozens of civilian vessels, everything from large merchant ships, store ships, down to canoes and rafts. Anything that will float is going to be used during this mass evacuation of Norfolk. Hundreds of civilians, probably thousands of civilians, will leave the city out of fear of Patriot reprisals. And they will take up in this fleet, this ragtag collection of, like I said, anything that floats, and it will become known as the Floating City. And the Floating City will become their home for the next 8 months. This is when George Washington famously writes, "I do not think that forcing his lordship on shipboard is sufficient. Nothing less than depriving him of life or liberty will secure peace in Virginia." So Dunmore evacuates Norfolk, and then the Patriots march in after him. And when they arrive, they receive a pretty cold reception from the few remaining people in the city. Again, they are fearing what is about to come now that the Patriots are in Norfolk and have control of Norfolk. The situation is going to grow extremely tense. The Battle of Great Bridge is December 9th. Over the next few weeks, it grows tense. Patriot forces will take up positions in buildings along the waterfront. They'll use those positions to snipe at British sailors and other folks within the floating city. They'll hurl the occasional shot into the fleet. Dunmore is cut off from supply. They need food, they need fresh water, things like that. They're going to try and land here and there to gather those things. They're going to be driven off by Patriots again and again and again. And eventually, Dunmore is just going to have enough. And on New Year's Day, 3 p.m., on New Year's Day, 1776, he's going to order his naval vessels to open fire on the waterfront of Norfolk and to focus their fire on the buildings that the Patriots have been using for cover, things like tobacco warehouses and so forth along the piers. This bombardment is going to go on for nearly 12 hours. It's going to cause a fair bit of damage along the waterfront. They're also going to land some sailors and Marines to torch these buildings. And this is going to, basically all hell breaks loose. The bombardment stops, the burning stops, but the Patriots, who have already, decided that they're not welcome in Norfolk, they don't really like the people of Norfolk, they see it as a nest of Tories, they're going to join in on the destruction. And those Patriot troops from North Carolina and from Virginia are going to start torching the town. They're going to start looting homes and buildings throughout the city, not just in the waterfront, but throughout the city. And what's going to follow is basically over the next few days is just an orgy of destruction. This is controversial. When it occurred, it was very easy propaganda for the Patriots to say, oh, look, Dunmore has destroyed Norfolk. Look, he's turned guns on the town. He's destroyed the city. Saying nothing about their role in the destruction. Dunmore, of course, will tell the opposite story, that it was the Patriots who did so. Well, the best proof we have comes from a commission that was held in 1777, so a year after the destruction. And it's going to come, this commission was assembled by the Virginia House of Burgesses. So a body of men who hate Dunmore. They have no reason to lie, to make him look good or anything like that. And what they found is that Dunmore was responsible for the destruction of 19 buildings during that initial bombardment and 54 buildings overall. A pretty big chunk of Norfolk was destroyed by Dunmore, 54 buildings. The Virginia and North Carolina troops were responsible for a total destruction of 1,279 buildings overall. 96% of the buildings in Norfolk that were destroyed not by Dunmore, but by Patriot troops. And they had personal reasons for doing this. Again, they saw it as a refuge for loyalists, as a hotbed of loyalism. They wanted to punish these people. There are strategic reasons as well. Depriving Dunmore or any other British troops from access to one of the best ports in North America was certainly on their mind. One of the eyewitnesses who was there was the future Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. He was there serving as a soldier with the Virginia troops, and he actually writes about it. He said, its destruction was one of those ill-judged measures of which the consequences are felt long after the motives are forgotten. So in a matter of a few days, the largest city in Virginia ceases to exist. One of the largest cities in the colonies just completely ceases to exist. Sorry, I forgot I had a few slides in here. This is the scene of Great Bridge today, just to give you an idea. That red square is about where Fort Murray was. There's one branch of the river just below it, and then right around by that second bridge towards the bottom is where a modern-day park is that commemorates the events that happened. All right. So here we have a map of the area. We have Norfolk, which is in ashes right now. Dunmore's fleet is out in the channel in the Elizabeth River. As I said, craft of every shape and size. They're going to be raiding up and down the area around Norfolk for food, for water, and so forth. You've got thousands of civilians. You've got hundreds of troops, including wounded from the Battle of Great Bridge. When you have this many people packed together in such cramped conditions, the number one fear in the 18th century is going to be disease. Things like typhus break out on the fleet. Dysentery breaks out on the fleet. And perhaps most disturbing of all is smallpox. Now, some of you might have tuned into our Historians on Tap the other night where I talked a little bit about the smallpox epidemic of 1775 to 1782. Dunmore's fleet is caught at the very leading edge of a continent-wide smallpox epidemic. And it is going to take a toll on his forces. There's accounts of bodies being thrown from the ships on a daily basis as victims succumb. There's going to be accounts of sharks following along behind the floating city because there's, fresh food being dropped every day, feeding on the corpses of those who died. I don't think I can put into words how horrific life aboard the floating city was. And these people endured it for months and months and months. It was absolutely an absolute nightmare. I don't know how else to put it. There's a glimmer of hope in February when the British General Clinton arrives in the Chesapeake Bay. He's got a fleet, he's got forces with him, and he's going to meet with Dunmore. And Dunmore is going to beg him, stay here in Virginia. I need men, I need help. If you support me, I will be able to recover Virginia. And Dunmore, Clinton, unfortunately, he demurs, he kind of goes back and forth, and then finally, he gets pressured to, instead of staying with Dunmore and recapturing Virginia, he's going to leave for Charleston. And this really, I think, embitters Dunmore. He feels completely abandoned by the British establishment at this point. He's not getting the support that he expects, the support he needs. And it's really a signal that he's on his own from here on out, and things will not get better. Disease will continue to ravage the fleet. In March, they will land at Tucker's Mill Point, which is this small point at Portsmouth, this little tip that juts out into the Elizabeth River. I can actually show you what it looks like today. It's this little point here, which is at the Naval Hospital now in Portsmouth. They're going to fortify that neck of land, and they're going to try to build hospitals for the sick men and women and children of the floating city. There's a belief that get them off the ships, get them into better air, get them like kind of quarantined, and we can stop this disease. So they will spend several weeks there. They have a loyalist carpenter from the area, Isaac Hildreth. He's going to build barracks for them. They're going to build hospitals. They're going to try to inoculate people against the smallpox. But every day their numbers continue to dwindle. At this point, there's probably only 100 men left in the Queen's Own who are fit for duty. There's only about 200 Ethiopian Regiment fit for duty, and there's only 40 men of the 14th Regiment who are still fit for duty at this point. This is how dire the situation is. It's so dire that in early May, Continental troops will arrive opposite Tucker's Mill Point, and Dunmore just does not have the strength to oppose them. So he will abandon their hospital facilities there and go back onto the living hell that is the floating city because he has no other choice. The floating city will leave Tucker's Mill Point in May. They will sail north, and they will sail up the Chesapeake Bay looking for another easily defendable spot where they can find some respite from the disease, from the lack of supplies that's been plaguing them. And the place that Dunmore will finally land upon is a little island off the Piankatank River. I hope I said that correctly, Piankatank River, known as Gwynn's Island. Gwynn's Island seemed like a really good spot because it's an island, it's easily defendable. It's a fairly large island. It's about 2,000 acres. There's good fresh water supplies. And the main landowner there, a man named John Grimes, was an avowed loyalist. So he figured they'd find some friendly population there. So on May 26th, 500 of his men, the last men he can really depend on, to be well enough to carry weapons will splash ashore at Gwynn's Island, and immediately they'll begin to set up the barracks, the hospitals, the inoculation stations, just as they had down near Portsmouth in March. John Grimes is going to greet them. He's going to offer his services to Dunmore. He's going to raise some of the locals into a cavalry company for Dunmore. There is a little bit of a respite at Gwynn's Island, at least initially. Dunmore is going to be getting some reinforcements. He sends ships off to the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia that bring back a few hundred men to help swell his ranks. They do find lots of livestock and fresh water on the island, but the Continental Army is not too far behind. There's a detachment of Continental troops under the command of Charles Lee. Oddly enough, one of Lee's adjutants during this is Francis Otway Byrd, who is the brother of Thomas Taylor Byrd, who's serving in the Ethiopian Regiment. So, you know, we literally have a case of brother fighting against brother here in the Chesapeake. So they set up their hospitals, they set up their inoculations, they're doing all right. But by early June, the Continental Army detachment has caught up with them and is going to begin to set up fortifications and siege guns to lay siege to Gwynn's Island. Here's a modern day map of Gwynn's Island just to give you an idea of what it looks like. It's roughly triangular. This part, kind of the northeastern part of the island, that is where John Grimes lived. Down in the southeast is where a lot of the smallpox hospitals were. And then all along the southern edge, there's going to be batteries of guns aimed at the mainland here to the south. Dunmore's fleet is going to anchor the floating town either to the west in Hills Bay, and then some of the ships in Milford Haven south of the island. And then here's an illustration of Gwynn's Island from Thomas Jefferson's notes. And it kind of gives you a good idea. You can see it's roughly kind of matches what you saw in the overhead satellite view. The Continentals are going to set up guns along the mainland facing the island. By July 9th, they are in position, and they are going to open fire on the island on the morning of July 9th. One of the first shots come crashing through Dunmore's flagship. Dunmore is actually wounded by a splinter as you know the ship is struck, and the ship immediately kind of slips its anchor and tries to escape. The ships that are in the haven and in the bay all try to escape. They're slipping their anchors. They're running into each other. They're becoming entangled. It's absolute chaos. And this is when Dunmore, I think, finally realizes that it's all over. He supposedly looks over and says to one of his associates, "Good God, should I ever have come to this?" Meanwhile, on the island, shells are raining down. Explosive shells are bursting all around. It's going to start fires on the island. Some of the sick, wounded, have been laid up in these brush shelters. Those are going to catch fire. A lot of the sick who are too ill to move will be burned alive. When the Continental troops come ashore, they find again an absolute nightmare. They find the shallow graves with hundreds of smallpox victims. They find people who were too ill to even be buried. They find men who had, as I said, burned alive in tents or in brush shelters. One of the very last to be evacuated from the island was actually Thomas Taylor Byrd, who was pulled across the island on a cart because he was so ill that he couldn't move. So he and what few survivors they were once again take to that floating city. But at this point, I think Dunmore realized there was no hope of coming back. This will also, incidentally, mark the last time that Dunmore sets foot on Virginia soil as governor. So again, this is really the end of royal authority in Virginia for once and for all. One of the things the Continentals also found on the island was a list of some of the enslaved people who had run away and joined the Ethiopian Regiment. As I said earlier, we have very few records on who these people are. We don't know much about them. This is one of the few things we do know, one of the few concrete pieces of evidence we have. And so this is what you see on the left here is a morning return from what they called Lord Dunmore's Black Banditti, but was the Ethiopian Regiment. And if you look closely, you will see it says kind of in the center here, Major Bird's Company. So that's that Thomas Taylor Bird, that wealthy Virginia planter turned British officer turned leader of formerly enslaved people. So Dunmore and the Floating City will leave Virginia for the last time, and they will head north. They will head into the Potomac River for their last stop in the Chesapeake Bay. They'll land in St. Mary's County, Maryland, the very southern tip of the western shore. They'll land at a little island called St. George's Island. You can see it kind of in the center here. It's a very small island. I've actually visited it several times. There's not much there. But it is their last attempt at landfall. On July 15th, the floating city approaches the island. It's led by a few row galleys, so you think like an ancient Greek kind of row galley, lots of oars and stuff, with cannon mounted on it. They're going to sail up alongside the island, row up and down the length of the island, kind of raking the island with cannon fire, while the last 300 or so troops that Dunmore has land and take possession of the island. And here's what St. George's Island looks like. I said it's very, very small, not too much going on there. It's just barely separated from the mainland by this really small isthmus, just not very far at all. The Loyalists stay there for about a week. They try to gather as much fresh water as they can. They start raiding up and down the Potomac. They actually raid as far north as Dumfries. There's some fear that Dunmore is going to try and land at Alexandria and maybe link up with a suspected force of Indians and Loyalists coming from the western frontier. Obviously, that never materializes. But they're only there for about a week before, again, just as at Gwynn's Island, Patriot troops will arrive to drive them off. A huge column of Maryland militia arrives at Piney Point, just opposite St. George's Island, and they are going to, again, just bombard the island from a distance. They're going to, honestly, the isthmus that kind of separate, or the channel that separates the island from the mainland is so small that they're just firing across it into the ships and so forth. And again, Dunmore and his men will be forced to leave. So the fleet will leave the Potomac River, and it will sail all the way down to Lynn Haven Bay, which is just off of where modern-day Virginia Beach is. They arrive August 2nd. So, as I said before, Dunmore and his followers, these civilians, these troops have been living on and off this floating city for 8 months. They arrive at Lynn Haven Bay, basically back where they started, back in January, off of Norfolk. And this is where the ordeal will finally end. They take any unseaworthy vessel and burn it. They crowd all the civilians onto ships bound for St. Augustine in Florida, British-held East Florida. Dunmore and any man who's well enough to carry a weapon will sail north to British-held New York City. This is the end of the campaign to take control, to regain control of Virginia for the royal government. And it really, as I said, over the last 8 months or so was an absolute nightmare. Ever since Dunmore's defeat at Great Bridge on December 9th of 1775, he'd lost his momentum, but he really, after abandoning Norfolk after Great Bridge, it was all downhill from there, and the situation just kept getting worse and worse. And I think Dunmore failed partially because of lack of support from the British government. They made it very clear that they were not going to help him. I think he overestimated Loyalist sentiment a lot. Had he managed to hold on to Norfolk and actually have a base to build from, maybe things would have been different. And then, we can't control nature. The smallpox epidemic, typhus, and everything else really decimated the troops that he had relied upon. So it's really a combination of factors that just doom him and doom royal control of Virginia. So just a few weeks, about a week or so, a few days actually, after they leave Lynnhaven Bay, Dunmore and what's left of his little army will limp into New York Harbor. And when they get there, there's only about 150 men between both of the Loyalist regiments left alive, between the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia and the Ethiopian Regiment. So let's talk about the aftermath. We'll talk about the white Loyalists first, those of the Queen's Own Loyal Virginia Regiment. They will disband that regiment in New York City, and the survivors of the regiment will form part of a newly organizing Loyalist regiment known as the Queen's Rangers. And if you look on the left, these guys in the green uniforms, that's a period illustration of the Queen's Rangers. They join Loyalists from New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, a lot of refugees coalescing in British-held New York. And the Virginians will actually play an extremely prominent role in the Queen's Rangers through the rest of the war. Many of the officers by the end of the war will be taken from those men who came to New York with Dunmore. Men like John Saunders. John Saunders will be a captain in the regiment. Stair Agnew, he's also a captain in the regiment. There's several other Virginians who rise to prominence. And it's largely through the professionalism of these Virginia officers who had seen combat in the Chesapeake that the Queen's Rangers will end up becoming one of the most prominent and one of the most effective Loyalist regiments of the war. They're so well regarded. They have such a great track record in combat that they, by the end of the war, will actually be taken on to the British Army as part of the American establishment. They become the first American regiment to become a part of the official British Army, which is pretty remarkable. Only 5 Loyalist regiments in the entire war out of dozens will get that distinction, and that's directly attributable to the role of some of these Virginians. The story of the Black Loyalists is a little more complex. The former commander of the Ethiopian Regiment, John Mackay, he will actually be commissioned into the Queen's Rangers. Thomas Byrd will stay with them for a little while. But like the Queen's Own, the Royal Ethiopian Regiment will be disbanded in New York. And these African Americans who had volunteered for service will end up in a British organization known as the Black Pioneers. Pioneer is the 18th century equivalent of like a modern engineer in the military. So a lot of the work that they're doing isn't necessary. They're not frontline combat troops, but what they're doing is they're building roads, they're building fortifications, they're working as teamsters and woodcutters and things like that with the British Army for pay. And the other real big thing that comes out of the Black Loyalist experience is that Dunmore's proclamation sets a precedent. Other British commanders will take up this idea that Dunmore pioneered of arming slaves or offering freedom to slaves. And over the course of the war, it becomes British war policy, official policy, to free these people in exchange for their service. And tens of thousands of enslaved people will come to the British Army in search of freedom. I mean, the most conservative estimates are probably 10,000, but I think the real number, we will never know for sure, is much higher. After the war, those Black Loyalists, who joined the British forces will, just like their white counterparts, receive land Many are given land in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia after the war. Some go to the Caribbean, particularly the Bahamas, where there was already kind of a large free black population. And eventually, many of those black loyalists and their descendants will end up becoming kind of the founding generation of the colony of Sierra Leone, founded in West Africa by the British as a place for formerly enslaved people to go. So this image on the right is one of my favorite images of the period. This was drawn in Shelburne, Nova Scotia in the 1780s, and it's of a black refugee working as a woodcutter. So one of the few first-hand examples we have of what life was like for these people. So what about Dunmore? What happens to Dunmore after all this is over? So after staying in New York for a few months, he will leave for Britain, and he spends the next few years during the Revolutionary War kind of tirelessly advocating at the British, to the British government, one, the need to reclaim Virginia, and he's going to make a big push to direct military expeditions to Virginia, none of which really manifest in the way that he expects or wants them to. But while he's there, he will also tirelessly advocate for loyalists, for the people who joined him, who lived through the floating city, who lived through the battles around the Chesapeake. He is advocating that these people need to be compensated in some way for their suffering, for the property that they lost. They lost their homes. Many of them lost everything they owned. Lived on board these ships for months with nothing but the clothes on their backs. And so he will advocate continuously with the British government for these people to get some sort of compensation. Like I said, Dunmore is often portrayed in Virginia history as, this kind of bloodthirsty tyrant, or, kind of this, this buffoon, guy who really had no idea what was going on. But one of the real positive traits I think Dunmore has is he absolutely has a great sense of loyalty to those who are loyal to him. Again, maybe that comes from his military experience, maybe it comes from his upbringing within the Scottish clan system. But personal loyalty seems to have mattered more to Dunmore than anything else. And no matter where these people came from, whether they were John Saunders or whether they were a former slave, he recognized their loyalty, and he felt it was his duty to do his best to help them. They put their lives on the line for him. It was his opportunity to do whatever he could for them. And so he will serve as a witness in a number of loyalist claims that are filed with the government. He'll personally testify on behalf of people of all walks of Virginia society to try and get these people some sort of compensation. It's really, again, a side of Dunmore that does not really come out as often as it should. Dunmore will set foot in the United States, in America, one last time towards the very end of the war. He's preparing, when he hears that Cornwallis is heading to Virginia, he prepares to head to Virginia to join him to kind of reclaim his governorship. But while he's on his way, he finds out that Cornwallis has surrendered and that the game is pretty much over. So his ship will then divert to Charleston. He'll land in Charleston in December of 1781 as the war is kind of winding down. And one of the things he does there is, again, he advocates in Charleston, South Carolina, of all places, for the emancipation of slaves as a source of manpower for the army. He's pretty much shot down almost immediately. Charleston is a very different environment than Virginia even. After the war, he will continue to serve in the British government. He serves as governor of Bahamas for a period. Again, he kind of gets into trouble because the Bahamas are a place where they're sending a lot of former loyalists. And these former loyalists who are newly arriving kind of don't mesh well with the established elite there in the Bahamas. So there's a tremendous amount of friction between these two factors. And Dunmore really finds himself in the middle of that. He's going to have a hard time kind of balancing the needs of the established Bahamians versus these newcomers. Again, another thing that he will do there is there's an attempt to force former Black loyalists in the Bahamas back into slavery, and that is something that Dunmore absolutely fights against with all of the power at his command. Again, he recognizes the service of these people and does not want to see them re-enslaved. So he becomes a very contentious figure in the Bahamas. Particularly a lot of the loyalists arriving are from the Carolinas. They have no attachment to him. They don't really know him, and they're going to try to undermine him at every step. So, very contentious man. Apparently, apparently he was personally a easy to get along with guy, but when it came to any position of power, as I said, he was maybe not the most tactful person. Certainly, I don't think the right person for the job in 1775 who could have easily maneuvered the situation. So this is just an image. This is a sketch that was made shortly after the war, kind of showing Britain receiving her loyalists, the people who had fought on her behalf. And what you see is a real kind of cross section of American society. You see there's a Native American very prominent. Most of the Native Americans took the side of the British Crown during the conflict. Down in the lower left, you see African Americans, representing the formerly enslaved people who fought on behalf of the government. You see kind of the top tier of people, planters, judges, lawyers in the front, but also kind of middle class people along the back. And I think it's a great reflection. As I said, we have this idea that all loyalists were very rich, they were very well established, wanted to keep the status quo, when in reality, something like a quarter of the population of the colony supported Britain during the conflict, and they came from every conceivable background. This building is probably one of Lord Dunmore's strangest legacies. This folly, as it was known, is Dunmore's Pineapple. This building still stands in Scotland at Dunmore's estate. It served as a greenhouse kind of building attached to his garden. And it's one of the few kind of legacies of Dunmore that still stands. It's my understanding that you can actually stay in this building now, which is I think fascinating. But it's certainly an eccentric building, and I think again it kind of speaks to the person who had it built. Dunmore was a complex guy. He was an eccentric guy. As I said, he could be very difficult to deal with, as so many of the governments that he had to deal with as governor of New York, Virginia, and the Bahamas found out. But he was not a stupid man. As I said, sometimes he's portrayed as a buffoon who's totally out of touch with his constituents. I don't think that was necessarily true. He was a man who just a complex man of his time. Certainly a man of the empire. He believed in the British Empire. He believed in the hierarchy that sustained it. But as I said, he was not above helping those who he recognized as allies and as people who had given their trust in him. So to kind of tie things up, I want to round about, we began this story, or at least the story of the military campaign, in 1775. We saw the destruction of Norfolk in January of 1776. And I think that this campaign and the eventual destruction of Norfolk has an incredible impact on the Revolutionary War as a whole, and it's an impact that we see in 1781 with the Siege of Yorktown. Cornwallis is deprived of a good naval base in Virginia, so he will settle on Yorktown as the place where he is going to make his stand. Had the city of Norfolk still existed at that time, It would have given the British access to a great deep water port. It would have given the British access to a lot of materials that they desperately needed. It would have given, it was a very defensible position compared to Yorktown. Now, whether or not Cornwallis would have been forced to surrender there, I don't know. You know, this is what if history, complete speculation at my point, or on my part. But by driving Dunmore out of Virginia in 1776, Virginia is able to focus on sending troops, material, food, products elsewhere to the front, whether it be in Pennsylvania or New York or down in the Carolinas. It keeps Virginia free of warfare for the most part for the next 5 years. And it deprives ultimately Cornwallis of, you know, probably the best base he could have hoped for in Virginia. So maybe in some roundabout way, I think that that Dunmore's being driven from Virginia so early in the war, in some small part, set up the eventual surrender at Yorktown 5 years later. And to wrap around to a local level, I mentioned Thomas Taylor Bird several times during this lecture. As I said, he's the son of one of the wealthiest families in Virginia. William Byrd III of Westover is his father. Thomas Taylor, as I mentioned, will swear off against his brother Francis at several points during these battles around the Chesapeake. Unlike many loyalists, Thomas Taylor Bird will actually go to Britain after the war. He will end up in Britain for several years following the war. He stays there till 1786 until he finally feels like he is safe to come home. He returns to Virginia in 1786, marries into the Armistead family, prominent family in Tidewater, Virginia. And because his father's lands, much of his father's lands had been taken or confiscated during the war, he will actually settle on a piece of property owned by his mother's family. And that piece of property is actually out in Clark County. He built a home called the Cottage not far from Millwood and would actually live there until the end of his life in the 1820s. You know, as a private citizen, he's buried at the old chapel just outside of Millwood. So this is a photo of his grave, kind of bringing it around to a local connection. So you can actually go out and visit the grave of one of the men who survived the floating town, who commanded troops in the Ethiopian Regiment, and you know who stood by Dunmore's side throughout this conflict. With that, I know that was a long talk, but with that, I'd like to end things. I know you guys can't ask me questions live right now, but I do invite you, if you watch this, if you have questions, maybe leave those questions in the comments section, or you can email me at tfshaw@mosbyheritagearea.org. Again, that's it's not TF Shaw, I'm sorry, tshaw@mosbyheritagearea.org. And I'd be happy to respond as well as I can to any of these questions. Thank you for bearing with us with the kind of technological limitations here. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, I encourage you guys to continue to support Nova Parks, continue to support the Mosby Heritage Area Association as we go through all this. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you'll join us again for another Conversations in History.